Good to see Alex and Jo on the screen. I'm Andrew Matthews, and this is a really exciting opportunity to connect with some like-minded people and challenge and explore some thinking around the modalities of coach supervision and how they might be useful in a wider context.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex from Oostveen, also coach and supervisor. And it's a pleasure to meet with Jo Searle, coach, psychotherapist, and supervisor, joining us today. And we're going to have a conversation about supervision and coaching. Jo, welcome to our show. And what would you like people to know about you?
Thank you. I suppose the main thing is that I am completely passionate about supervision because I retrained as a psychotherapist in the mid-90s. I originally trained as a chartered accountant, fell in love with people development, so retrained as a psychotherapist. And my greatest learning was from being in supervision. So the requirement of my training was to be in supervision for 6 months before I saw a paying client. And that's where I did my most learning. So I see the value in supervision as the best coach training, actually. So I think coach trainings are very valuable because they give you a basic framework, but I don't think they really teach you how to work with clients over time. So I trained in the UK. I was in supervision until I moved back here to South Africa in 2003. And then I battled to find the supervision of the caliber that I was used to, and eventually trained as a supervisor myself in 2010. But I started working with clients, with coaches as a supervisor in 2008. So I wanted to formalize my experiential training, which I felt like I'd had up until that point. And I really love and see the value of supervision.
Lovely, thank you. So off screen, a couple of weeks ago, we had an informal conversation, which leads to why we're here today. And it was, help me clarify this, something about applying a supervision modality to people who are not coaches. And then my curiosity really sparked when you talked about doing that. And it's not the first time that I've heard people talk about that. I think Robin Showett has done the same on one or more of his webinars. And I thought it might be like a good foundation to start from if I share with you my idea of supervision in relation to coaching, and why I'm curious about what you said.
Okay.
So let's assume that people understand what coaching is, and in cast our eye on supervision. And I see supervision as relevant to coaches because it can cover the wide scope of experiences that coaches have as a coherent modality. So coaching being a coherent modality, there's certain experiences which are likely to happen, like transference and countertransference, working in organizational environments with the different parties there, contracting, these kinds of things. And supervision is a useful way for those practitioners to understand those dynamics theoretically, to notice when they're happening in practice and how to respond to them. So I'm very curious about how supervision can be applied to people who are not coaches.
Okay. So I think all of what you say is true. And I share the view that Robin showed, like you mentioned, says everybody needs a supervisor. And I suppose what we're trying to distinguish then is why a supervisor rather than a coach, because, you know, so fundamentally everybody could do with a coach. But I think of, if I try and answer that question, then I think of supervision as a process which which helps create shift or transformation through relationship. So if I say I think everybody needs a supervisor, it's that part of the relationship piece that if I recognize that I'm stuck in a relationship or there's a challenge, be it transference, countertransference, projection, or whatever it is, if I understand that ultimately I'm the one who has to make the shift in order to shift the relationship, that's how I understand supervision in process and principle. So you could call it a form of coaching, but I do think supervision training makes us better coaches. But if I'm working with a coach in supervision and they're bringing anything from their practice, I'm focusing on that piece that says, what's the shift in me that will create the shift in my coach that creates the shift in their relationship with their client that helps them get unstuck?
So you're talking about positive parallel process then?
Process. Yeah. And I think that's true of anybody in relationship. And so that means we can all do that work. And I think of that as fundamentally the process of supervision. And if we understand that, then when we're working as coaches who've been trained as supervisors, we're also working in that way, because you can't unlearn that. If that makes sense. So you could distill it down to the projections, the countertransference, the transference, and we're always looking at what is our part in the that needs to shift the relationship. So that could be doctors, you know, anybody who works with people, I think, could reflect on their practice, not in an academic way of content, but in a process way in terms of how do they form relationships that support the benefit of them and their client ultimately. Am I making sense? So yeah, we could talk about the theory whenever we're in that situation. We could talk about what's your transference, what's your countertransference, etc. But ultimately, it's what's the shift do I need to make in the relationship.
So it's interesting. You've got me reflecting on my own experience of having started off coaching and then experienced my own supervision and then done supervision training, and my learning about coaching through actually being a supervisor. So my own experience is that I certainly recognize the phenomena of relationships like transference and countertransference, projection in coaching more so now that I'm a supervisor than before.
Sure.
And these are things, or these phenomena are part of the everyday language of supervision. And so maybe I'm taking too much of a reductionist approach here, but I'm thinking about when you say that coaches in turn shift the relationships with their client because of the parallel process that they've experienced with their supervisors. It seems to me that the coach is still doing coaching and they've learned how to transform a relationship because of a supervision intervention. And I'm still struggling in my mind to distinguish then that supervision can be applied to non-coaches when a coach is doing that themselves already, but they learn to do it when they get stuck. So let me phrase it a different way. I think a coach doesn't necessarily have to go to supervision in order to respond effectively and appreciatively and transform a relationship with their own clients. For instance, if they've already integrated a lot of learning from supervision, or maybe just through their own personal development, they might be doing that anyway. And I find supervision particularly useful when I'm unable to do that because of something that's still remaining stuck or outside of my awareness as a coach. And then I call on another resource, i.e. the supervisor. So it's at that point that I kind of get an additional perspective and a resource which works cognitively and transformationally to help me get past that stuckness. So I can see the role of supervision, but I also think that coaches can do that transformational bit without necessarily having to make use of the supervision. And that takes me back to the first question again is, supervision applied to non-coaches seems to be maybe redundant because coaches can already do that.
I don't know that they can.
Ah, okay. I'm curious. Tell me more.
No, I think that if you're a coach who is self-aware and is willing to do your own personal work, then you know how to, generally, if you get stuck, you know what you need in order to get unstuck, which is possibly to have a supervision session. I think if you see how few coaches are in supervision and how limited coach training is in teaching or working through what I call the psychological understanding of projection, what happens in a relationship, I think very few coaches actually will relate to our conversation in terms of the value of supervision. So that's an aside. So coaches, I think, can do it, but then there are coaches who will say that person's not coachable. And I don't believe in uncoachability. I believe it generally will reflect our own, as coaches, our own ability to meet clients where they're at. But I think that I'm still saying that the value of the process of supervision is available to everybody or could be available to everybody. So are we talking at different understandings here?
I wonder, Alex, I was wondering if maybe there was, when Jo said something about, actually I can't remember exactly what it was, but you did an aha, and it seemed like maybe there was a way of speaking about something or a way of understanding something that was something different to what you were holding, and maybe that was getting in the way a bit. What I've been reflecting on while listening to you guys is my own journey with coach supervision, both receiving it and being trained in it, and now wearing that hat myself. I remember in my supervision training, constantly feeling like, but this is what I want to be doing as a coach. So why is this different as a coach supervisor? And at some stage, one of the trainers had to pull me aside and say, Andrew, are you okay? Is this making sense to you? Because I kept getting stuck on, but hang on, why are we talking about this as a separate practice when this is what I strive for or really wish for to be doing as a coach? So I think that already made me start to think of that the scope of that style of relationship is wider, can be wider than just engaging with a coach. And at that point, I was reflecting on my experience as a swimming instructor in the past and thinking how having supervision type conversations really helped me in that space. And I was thinking about other people that I was engaging with, and they were service providers to me. And I was thinking I could see where they were probably projecting some of their own stuff into this relationship, and they could benefit from a coach supervision style support mechanism. So already at the beginning, I was thinking there's potential of something wider here. But what I wondered going through this discussion today is thinking about some of the key models that I hold in mind of what starts to create the framework or the scaffolding of supervision. And the main ones that came to mind was the Supervision Triangle and the 7-eyed model of coach supervision, or the multi-eyed, depending on whose version you want to talk about. And if you take the labels out, so the coach and the client, and you start to put in different people in there, it's very easy to see that model can apply to anybody, because you're bringing a systems awareness to somebody's life. So if the 7-eyed, 8-eyed, or 10-eyed model is something that's significant in what we hold true as coach supervision, it's very easy to just cut and paste different names or titles and see how that can be quite useful. And similarly, then looking at the supervision triangle and looking at what's the hopefulness out of engaging with the different themes of that triangle, and think of loads of people that can benefit or will benefit or have benefited from having engagement around the different themes or hopes out of the different points of that supervision triangle, who may or may not be coaches. So those two is the significant backbones. They're at least what we're presented first and foremost to in my supervision training, seeing how useful they are outside of just working with coaches. The other thing that had been significantly useful for me was the Trudy Newton's Continuum of Supervision. And on one side, she talks about functions, and then the other side, I can't remember what the other side is. But it's looking at that
from doing to being, isn't it, ultimately? That formative developmental, something like that, isn't it?
Something like that. But it's the looking at the Jo, you spoke about relationship, and it had on the continuum, there's different flavors to the relationship. So you go from something where the supervisor might be quite structuring to the other end where the supervisor might be quite nurturing. And if you look at the theme and the style of that relationship, I can see how that has been really valuable in informing how I engage with people, both inside my practice and also my personal life. So when I hold those three things on this sort of like platter in front of me, say, well, yes, they're the fundamentals and the backbones of what I hold true as structural, theoretical supervision, and yet I find them transformational and high rates of permission giving for me to show up more authentically with others. And I think that's a real gift when you start to take I can only do this with the coach when I'm contracted as a supervisor. You take that out of the way, it made me feel liberated.
I think that's a very helpful way of describing it, because as Alex was talking last, I was going to say, let's look at the distinctions between coaching and supervision in order to understand how it would apply. And one of them is reflective practice, but that is what coaches do as well, as we see the value of reflective practice. But how you've applied the models, Andrew, I think is very helpful, because I think that's what I mean about us not unlearning. For me, I've done coach mastery training to become master coaches and supervision training. And actually, I find that they're very similar when you get to that level. So I think the supervision training helps us master coaching in a way that is transformational rather than more kind of doing. It is more about the transformational through relationship that we learn as supervisors. And I agree with you. I think it's applicable and anybody can learn. Because I'm thinking of, organizational consultants I've worked with where I will think about them in the system and how the parallel process is affecting them and how they can shift that. And they're not coaches, but they are benefiting from the process and principles of supervision when I work with them. Because if you think of some of the professions we're talking about, I think of accountants, doctors, lawyers, they do to other people or for other people, consultants. They don't necessarily think of themselves in that relationship and how they bring that impacts the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, the process and principle of supervision is really valuable for them starting to take ownership of themselves in that relationship rather than just the expert, the academic, or the subject matter expert. It's content rather than process. And supervision for me is very process-based, if we're good at it as supervisors.
I want to offer a perspective in challenge to what both of you have said.
Okay.
I'm hunkering down.
Yeah, go for it.
So I'm going to attempt to relate my observations of a much wider system here and bring it back to the point of our conversation. I think there are market forces at play and there's psychological forces at play which bring people to coaching with an expectation that it's going to have a focus on their doing. The market forces are companies want a changed behavior. They are driven by their own market forces. And they want a measurable and sustained output from the coaching. On the psychological level, I think, and this is my own experience, I'm not going to be confident or bold enough to extrapolate that to other people's experiences. But my own experience is that most people are not aware of the intrapsychic or even the interpsychic. So physical feelings, emotional experiences, patterns of thinking, relational dynamics, problem-solving methods which can be defined. So I'm talking about be perfect, hurry up, try hard, be strong, please people, that kind of thing. And often in a coaching conversation, it starts with the client going into a detailed story about the circumstances. So they're focused on the what. And at least within the modality of coaching that I generally practice, that's not where the opportunity for change lies. The opportunity for change lies in the person's internal default reactions to, and after the coaching, their changed responses to the circumstances. So for me, the coaching process involves bringing the client's focus from the external and the doing to the internal and the who. I wondered if at a point in the conversation, I'm going to struggle to remember the exact words, there was an assumed definition of coaching being transactional and not transformational. Okay, so see that's not the case, which is good, because I think coaching has a foot in both worlds, and it's about bringing one foot out of the transactional into the transformational, and then looking at how the person finds their own balance. So when can they lean on the transformational aspect, and how does that impact what happens in the transactional aspect? Supervision I'll mention a model here that we haven't used yet, the Supervision Triangle, which I think it has a cognitive aspect to it and a transformational aspect to it, or an emotional, humanistic, and a being aspect to it. And to me, this is the primary argument for supervision being specific to coaches or practitioners in the helping domain, because the cognitive aspect of supervision will help the practitioner not only recognize the dynamics unfolding in the case that they bring to supervision, but apply it to future cases and other cases that are playing out in their own present circumstances. And the transformational aspect will be, who are they within those relational dynamics? And the one term used to describe the root of that is the core issue. So what is the personal area for developmental growth within the practitioner that gets them stuck in these dynamics from time to time? So it's something, when you're stuck in a dynamic, you're not consciously, or there's an aspect of your unconscious which is playing out. So it might be a problem-solving style, it might be something that's triggered by the client's transference. And the one function of the supervision is to help the person become aware of that cognitively, but also to shift it transformationally. And then using theory or a model or a metaphor to understand how that dynamic plays out, so that they know the moves, they know the roles, and they know the solution that they can apply to that circumstance and others. And my argument is that I don't see that that's, I mean, I can understand that it would be beneficial to a non-coach to see those things, but I think they would have limited application for it after the intervention. So a stay-at-home dad or a team leader in a corporate environment may not apply the learning that they get from the supervision in an ongoing basis, because it's not at the core of what their role is as a human being or a worker. But for a coach, it is core to their role to understand these dynamics, to build up a toolkit or more a library of what these dynamics are, because they're bound to encounter them due to the nature of their practice. And I think non-coaches aren't necessarily bound to encounter those so much. What's your pushback or challenge or thinking on that?
Yeah, so I think there's a both and. I think as a coach, if that is my job, then I am focused on how I understand it, how I apply it, and how I develop myself to be a better coach and to identify, to work with, to grow and develop and evolve. But I think if you take the triangle, which actually Andrew did mention earlier, If you take the triangle, then I think if you see it as a self-awareness tool, the principles are true, and I may or may not be able to, you said a limited application, I may or may not be able to remember and apply it. But if, as a stay-at-home dad, I am, just continue to get pissed off with my ex-wife or whatever, and blame her. But if somebody holds up a mirror and says, you are part of the relationship, your experience of it is something you could do differently, and he thinks, okay, or yes, I could see that. And if I shift it, then I have a different experience of myself, different experience of the relationship, and I model something different for my kids. I may or may not be able to continue to apply it. I will revert, because we do revert to type, and we do take time to learn to shift our patterns. But I could have a different experience of myself. And maybe it won't last forever. But if I went back to that supervisor, I might start to learn to shift that. So for me, it's the principle of supervision, which is applicable to every single experience we have in relationship.
I agree with you.
And so, but I wouldn't, but I'm as a stay-at-home dad, I'm an accountant. It doesn't necessarily, I don't necessarily need to understand the theory or the pinning or the why. I just need to know that I have momentary relief, and I get to know myself better, and I can choose to do something different. And then I can maybe extrapolate the other areas in my life. But that takes the willingness to work on ourselves. And I'm saying not even a lot of coaches are willing to do the work on themselves. So I did talk about the coaching, the transactional to transformational, and I think that's also the developmental journey that coaches can go on. Don't all go on. But I mean, I want to be a transformational coach, not a transactional one, and I believe that market forces want to see a change, and what do you say, measurable and sustainable output and change in behavior. And I don't believe you can actually do that without doing the transformation underlying, because then we're not dealing with what creates resistance, which is usually something like the key issue or the underlying issue or the core issues.
And it's not sustainable if there's no transformation. Then it's just going through the motions.
Yeah. I can do something different next time, and I can tick that box, but it's not internalized or integrated.
And the core issue is likely to raise its head again, especially when the person's under some kind of pressure. So this, I'm smiling so much because I fully agree with everything you've said, and I'm still left wondering. So then there's this thing called supervision, which because we've labeled it as under a different name, and there's a thing called coaching, and then
there's a thing called psychotherapy, and actually it's no different.
Yeah, and this is dangerous ground. Remember, we're in South Africa.
No.
So then, is there an overlap, like in a Venn diagram, or does the one completely encompass the other? What are the boundaries around each of those? Or is supervision just one part further down the developmental journey of a coach? These are semi-rhetorical questions.
But I think it's once we've learned to be supervisors, we integrate it in how we work.
As coaches?
I think as coaches, because I think the principle and the process applies in all of our engagements when we're working. So it's like I say, I can't unlearn what I have learned about what supports effective change or transformation. And even though I might be working with somebody who's not working with a client, and a coach working with a client, I'm using the supervision principles that I've learned to support them in changing their experience.
That supervision continuum with with all those functions, the one that's in the middle is actually called coaching, or co-creative work. And at times when I felt like, okay, now I have to put my coaching hat on, I felt like this continuum was maybe like the width of a river. And going through the training, I went from a stream to being widened into being a river. And now when all of a sudden, when I have to put just my coaching hat on, I felt like I'm being forced to funnel my waters through something that's constraining and maybe even starting to dam something. And I think that came to mind, Jo, hearing you about integrating some more deeper, whatever other descriptors there are, into how I can show up with clients. And Alex, maybe, so what your question, your hypothetical question, I obviously don't have anything concrete around this, but what had started to go through my mind was, if we start to look at what's the objective of each one of these practices, and so if we start to look at the mode of the practice and the objective of the practice, it might start to create a bit more of a smorgasbord of helping options that people can go and say, this is what I need now to help me with what I'm dealing with at the moment. So looking at, one of the big distinctions of going from coaching to coach supervision was that coaching has a start and an end, and supervision, it's quite encouraged to nurture a long relationship with your supervisor, so that they can build up a rapport, and then in the therapies, depending on what's bringing somebody into therapy, there's the potential of doing past work to help relieve certain discomforts in the present. But then obviously there's a lot of the positive psychology, which many people have said has hardly, if any, differences to coaching. But maybe there's something that starts to create I think there's something about enabling the potential buyer to be aware of what is the best source of help that they want to engage with at that time. And so something about coaching maybe being a targeted piece of work, coach supervision being an ongoing practice of sharpening your saw, and supervision, I'm quite sure what I just said. Did I say coaching, supervision, and then something else?
Psychotherapy.
And then psychotherapy being the one where maybe if something deeper comes up, if there's a constant roadblock that's coming in the way, and maybe there's something pathological underlying that, to then move into a therapy place to be able to work at a deeper level.
I think that's absolutely helpful. And I do think that as we know more, or as we learn more as coaches or supervisors and do the work on ourselves, we start to see there isn't anything different, or there isn't anything new. So if we simplify the process, there isn't anything different. I think if you think of some of John, do you know John Charles Barlow?
No.
Some of his work with coaches is around, it's not about whether it's coaching or therapy, it's about our own ability, our own competence and capacity to deal with whatever a client brings. So we don't assess clients, we assess ourselves in terms of our ability to work with what's being brought. If that makes sense. And you know how Trudy talks about the distinction between coaching and psychotherapy, that spiral. If you think of the developmental model, which is a spiral, which at different stages and ages of our lives, we're dealing with different developmental issues, and we can revisit those. And when a client if they bring something in, we know that there's something in their history or their patterning that means they keep getting stuck. If you look at, say, Gestalt or whatever, you don't need to go back to the point in the history where that breakdown happened in their development, because they can do something different in their present day relationships that may change that belief system or that breakdown, unless they keep cycling back, and then we know that's when we need to refer, because we're not qualified to deal with that piece of history, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that coaching is therapeutic, but we don't like to call it therapy, but it can be therapeutic, I think, as we all know.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. So yeah, carry on, Alex.
I have a question. I believe that coaching and supervision can be therapeutic. I think supervision is more likely to be therapeutic than coaching is, or maybe it has more potential to be therapeutic than coaching. And I'm just remembering the kind of one subtitle of what supervision is. It's psychological mindedness. So for me, that's, I know there's so many different ways people practice supervision, but at least within, I think, our common modality, there's an element of psychological mindedness to it, which is there's a thinking element to it. So it's understanding the psychology of what's going on in the relationships, whether that's relationship with client or relationship with practice or organization, but also not just cognitively understanding, but in a physical, and an emotional, and spiritual, and in a being way, recognizing who one is in those relationships. So it's about really being present with all aspects of one's own subjective experience in those moments of relationship. So recognizing, this is what it's like for me when my core issue is showing up. Being able to recognize that, and it might almost sound paradoxical, but through the process of supervision, because that core issue is transformed, it's not necessarily going to show up in the same way every time. It might be diluted, it might always be there in some kind of form, but it's being able to recognize it and not just go through the motions when one recognizes it, but because of the transformational aspect, in an authentic and an embodied way, be able to be different with the other in the relationship. So I'm feeling bold and happy to talk about coaching, supervision, and psychotherapy, and how different and same they are, knowing that legally in this country at least, and I think many others, there is a lot of tension around those topics. And I was so intrigued by something you said earlier, Jo, about within the relationship, it's about recognizing help me if I'm wrong, recognizing one's own capacity to work with what the client brings. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you say capacity, there are two ways that I can interpret that. The one is one's personal capacity to be with whatever's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not about what letters are behind your name, or what qualifications you have. And the other way of interpreting it is one's professional or legal capacity, which is about the letters.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I want to link that to something else said a few moments later, which was about when we work with a person who's becoming stuck due to something that's happened in one of the earlier cycles, to use that model, then we refer because we don't have the qualifications to deal with it. And then I thought to myself, well, I might not have the qualifications, but I have the capacity. What is your thinking about this?
Well, I mean, I'm less hung up on the qualification than the say personal and professional capacity and competence. So I need to have some awareness and recognize my own competence to work with whatever the issue is. So there's a competence and a capacity piece. So, and that is for me a self-assessment. But you know, self-assessment, responsible self-assessment, should I say? Something I might
not
take
an
to
ego-based one.
Not an ego-based one, and also not a kind of a knee-jerk. Oh my goodness, this is therapy. I need to refer this client immediately, because I think that can lead to rejection and abandonment issues in the client. So it's that, you know, willingness to be in supervision and reflect on where we are with our clients, and, you know, have the conversation that coaches them to get the help that they need if we don't have the competence, capacity. And that's a self-assessment, not necessarily an external assessment based on a qualification. Because you can be a clinical psychologist and have the competence, the qualification, but choose not to work with, I don't know, incest issues or sexual abuse, because that's part of your history and it's not something you want to be working with because of what it brings up for you. And I've known psychologists and psychotherapists who will make those assessments. And they certainly have the training and the qualification to do it. So that's why I say I think it's very important to honor that in the relationship, is who I am in this relationship as well as my client, because it's ultimately going to be through the relationship that we have the successful outcome in coaching and or therapy. I mean, the research says it's less the models and methodologies than it is the success, the relationship we build. So I do think we hung up on the distinctions so much, but if you start to read, if you do read what is the latest in psychotherapy in terms of neuroscience and all the modalities, we're doing the same in coaching, pretty much. If you think there's Gestalt coaching, there's narrative coaching, there's transactional analysis, you know, we're borrowing or using all of the same things, and the neuroscience impacts us both equally as psychotherapists and coaches. So I think as we develop the coaching profession, we see that we're more similar than different.
It's I'm probably going to be crucified for saying this. It's crossed my mind that this distinction is a false one, because there is hallowed ground. But simultaneously, I believe that there should be hallowed ground too, because I think a lot of that's got to do with coaches who don't go to supervision.
Yep.
So they don't have that capacity we've been talking about, and the training's lacking in many ways as well. And
totally.
I mean, there are market forces at play there
agree
too.
With you. Yeah.
Because the coach training is a lot cheaper than training to become a psychotherapist, and it's shorter.
Some coach training.
Sure.
Some are very expensive.
I'm painting with a broad brush.
Yeah. I mean, when I first moved here, one of the first coaches I worked with was Mark Kahn. And his first talk that he did for Commensa was called "The Difference Between Coaching and Therapy is Politics." He was very provocative.
So, a couple of years ago, Sarah van der Hoon did a talk for the ICF, talking about her experience of the difference between coaching and therapy, for herself being a trained therapist and now doing, at that time when she spoke, mostly coaching. and she did a lot of discussion around critique of the DSM and the way that's been constructed, and where for the vast majority of the diagnosis diagnoses in there, it's out of these 10, somebody who demonstrates 7 of them can now be diagnosed with this condition. And she was saying, well, if somebody engages with coaching and then only now demonstrates 5 out of the 10, but had previously demonstrated 7, are they now still diagnosed with having that condition? So, and what she circled this back to was, what is a person's vitality to actually make an effect change in themselves? And statistically, they talk about 30% of the global population being potentially diagnosable by something in the DSM, but the vast majority of those 30% actually just want to get on with their lives and live a good life. You know, when you take, Alex, when you're saying about that, there should be hallowed ground, because within that there is obviously people that need therapeutic support and help. So it's, I think, you know, we're probably, I think it's through conversations like this that we start to raise the awareness and maybe raise the confidence to maybe challenge and engage in conversation with the definitions that have been hallowed ground for so long, and they will be hallowed ground for a long time to come. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be having these conversations.
Lovely. So, Jo, is there anything else that's come to mind or that you want to bring into the conversation?
No, I mean, the only thing I want to add is that it just, as we have this conversation, it becomes very more clear, and I know I'm preaching to the converted, of the need for coaches to be in supervision. I mean, because that is where they will learn this. They won't learn it necessarily from coach trainings.
Yeah. Okay.
What do you think is the without propelling us down another rabbit hole, is there a short answer to what do you think is the main thing that stops coaches from coming into supervision?
Oh, I don't know. I think possibly lack of awareness.
How interesting that supervision is like one of the best avenues for awareness.
I know.
Chicken and egg scenario.
I don't know if you were on that call. You know, people say it's the name. I'm trying to find a thing where Robin, on that call with Robin Shad, where somebody said they were looking at his book, In Love with Supervision, and his 6-year-old kid came in and she said to him, do you know what supervision is? Do you know what that means? Yes, he says it's a superpower. It means you can see through everything and see what's really there.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, supervision really is. I just want to say it's my superpower.
Yeah. And the wonderful thing is it's based on people's experiences. So there's so much rich opportunity for learning.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So Jo, where can people reach you?
Email jo@sacoachingcentre.co.za. I've had a website under construction for many, many years and I'm not there yet. But I am on Coach Directory as well. People do find me on the internet. So there's a mystery as to how they do that, because they never know how, but I am on Coach Directory. I think that might be how people find me on the internet.
Right. Well, thank you. I love the conversation. And I love the conversations where I don't leave with definitive answers.
Yes.
Because that might mean my learning has stopped.
I was thinking we didn't actually resolve it, but I still fundamentally believe everybody could benefit from a supervisor.
I would want to say at some point I wondered if this might slip into Jo and myself trying to convert you, Alex. But I'm happy that we avoided that fork in the road.
Yeah.
Really-
Yeah.
Are there
really
no
had that
rights
time
and wrongs,
together.
are there?
Yeah, I also noticed the potential for that to happen. But what I appreciated so much is that we were able to hold these sometimes opposing perspectives up to the light and just look at what's there.
I mean, I guess that's the beauty of it, isn't it? We recognize the diversity in this profession. And that we can't, there is no wrong or right, although we do believe in, I think, self-regulation or some form of professional accountability through our ongoing work on ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's an area which supervision supports, because it's not there as a formal part or formal structure in the system of coaching. Good. Well, thank you.
Great, thank you. That was fun.
Thanks, everyone.